Could I ask you all to go outside? Yes, thank you.
The suggestion is, those of you who are in the back, if you can get closer without violating social distancing, that might be helpful. We appreciate that. Also, because this is also being recorded and some of the folks at home would like to participate, at least in terms of hearing the conversation, we're going to have to ask you if you have a comment or a question to come up to what I call the prayer mic. So come up to the mic and make those comments so that those can be recorded and people at home can be a part of it in that way. Okay? So thanks for sticking around and being a part of it. This morning I intentionally took a look at the world church, the global church, because I wanted to make the point that we are looking at Christianity in this session, in this series of messages. We're going to look primarily at it within the context of the United States. But though we sometimes don't believe it, there is a lot more to the world than the United States. And especially that is also true with the church. So that was the intention this morning, is to just give you a sense of what's going on around the world. So let me just ask you, I finished the sermon, which was not a typical sermon, obviously, and probably that will be true throughout this series. But I finished by asking you the question, so all these examples I gave you of these incredible things that are going on, do you see any pattern? Do you see any trend? Is there any commonality there that you can identify? And I'm sorry, but you're going to have to go to the mic every time, guys. It's a pain, but that's the only way it'll work.
One thing that came to mind for me was that, and I've seen this in so much of the more conservative churches, the Assemblies of God, the more conservative denominations, are the ones who are growing. And I see that in the U.S., I see it in this town, and in a lot of surrounding towns. Where are we missing the boat?
Okay. I think that's a fair comment. It isn't always true. We can find some progressive churches that are thriving, but statistically, on average, I think you're right. And we'll go into this more deeply in later sessions in more detail. But yes, there are certain demographics, certain segments of the church that are growing significantly, and others that are not. And Beth, are you asking a question?
We'll go after Barbara.
What?
I would go after Barbara.
Okay. Barbara.
I think the one thing that really hit me when you were giving all of these statistics, to me it seemed like they were all less developed countries than the United States. There were some where you talked about, I think, indigenous groups and things of that nature. So I would say maybe less fortunate people, people who have less than what we have here in the States.
Bing, 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 bing. You win the prize. This was not a setup, but it could well have been, because this is a huge factor. And I just want to, we will get to Andrea, we'll get to Beth, but since she has raised that point, and it's an important point, I just want to share with you a little bit more information about that. You all know that I am a phenomenal graphic artist. My art skills are just beyond comprehension. Yeah, it's incomprehensible, isn't it? So I will try to explain this chart, and hopefully most of you can see it, and if you can't, then that's a good reason to come closer. But this is a chart that tracks the church from day 1, 33 AD, when Pentecost happened, to the year 2000. Okay? And it is showing us where the church is growing and where it is shrinking. Or to put it another way, where most of the Christians in the world are. Okay? Where most of the Christians in the world are. So we have two categories, and I had to do a lot of research after Anna called me to task this week. We were having a conversation about this, and I was telling her about this, but I was using the words Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. And she said, China's not in the Southern Hemisphere. Korea's not in the Southern, She's just blowing my whole theory right out of the water. So I went back. Spouses can be challenging, even as they're being helpful. And I said to her yesterday, I'm sure glad you brought this up ahead of time, because it's better than if I heard it this morning for the first time. So we are not talking about the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. We're talking about the global North and the global South. And that is a term that came into use in the mid-20th century, about 1950 or so was the first time it was used. But then it got extremely popular, and now it's so popular that as of last week, I even understand what it means. The global North and the global South has to do, this is politically correct language for what used to be referred to as the Third World, or then it was the Two-Thirds World, then it was the Developing World. All of those terms were deemed in one way or another to be chauvinistic or denigrating to people in those places. And so they came up with this term global North and global South, even though it is not strictly geographically defined. The global North is basically what we would call first world countries. It is primarily North America and Europe, as well as some of Eastern Europe. The rest of the world is the global South. Latin America, Africa, most of Asia, that's the global South. So that's how we've defined it, or how it's been defined. And this is what it shows. That when the church was formed on Pentecost, what percentage of the church was in the global South? The Middle East is, of course, included in the global South. 100%. It was all in the global South. And for many, many decades, it was all in the global South. But then it began to spread. But even though it spread to places like Africa, global South. Okay? So eventually you begin to see this decline, so that there is some of Christianity in the global North. And then as you see, as you go along here, and this about right here is when Constantine made Christianity the state religion, and that has a huge impact in its spread because the Holy Roman Empire pushes it into Europe to begin. Okay? And so more and more of the church is now in the north. And we get to the point, and scholars say the year 923. I don't know how they can come up with a specific year, but let's just say at about 900 AD, we get to the point where there are more Christians in the global north than there are in the global south. And then, as you see, here's 1500 AD. That would be the time of the Reformation. So look at that. What this says is, at this point in time, all of this is Christians in the global north, and just this little teeny bit, it's something like 7% of the church was in the global south at the time of the Reformation. So the church was highly concentrated primarily in Europe, and then as we move on here, in North America and the United States and Canada and places like that. But then the trend begins to reverse itself, and reverse itself rather quickly and rather dramatically. So that, again, the scholars suggest 1981 as the approximate year when half of all the Christians were in the global north and half the Christians were in the global south. So you see what's happening from here? So today, about 66%, about 2/3 of all the Christians in the world are in the global south. Okay? 2/3 of all the Christians in the world are in the global south. So all of those examples I used in my sermon, what do they have in common? They're all from the global south. Now, we could find some examples of churches that are thriving in North America and Europe, but they are isolated incidences, and they are not the major trend. So this is the major trend, and we never know where the Spirit of God blows, but at least at this point, it looks like that trend is going to continue, and the number of Christians in the north is going to get smaller and smaller, the number of Christians in the south larger and larger. Okay? So now let's go to Beth. I just wanted to share that information because I think that's pretty important to understand. You're the one that told me we have to use the mic, so.
I'm actually going to defer my comment a little later because it's a bit on a different tact. So I think we should give folks an opportunity to respond to what you just said.
Okay.
And remind me to get a picture of that before you tear it down.
I'll try to remember. Yes, Andrea.
In addition to the countries that are growing in Christianity, having a lack of resources and a lot of poverty, there are also most of those countries have a very restrictive government and a lot of control, and so the people are more in need of hope, both for physical resources, but especially for spiritual resources as they're being pushed down or in war-torn countries and poverty. So those are the three elements that I noticed.
Thank you. And that just goes exactly where I was going to go sooner or later, which is to ask the question, so why? Why is it that the church is growing dramatically in the South? And for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, shrinking fairly significantly in the North. And I think you've just identified some of those factors. So the big picture answer might be, to summarize what you've said, is places where people do not feel self-sufficient. Most of us, I'll speak for myself, I pretty much feel like I've got life under control. I've got a handle on it. I have what I want. I have a good education. I have financial resources. I have relative security. I know there are things like death that probably I won't be able to avoid inevitably or forever. Probably. But, you know, as we get successful, economically and in other ways, we have a tendency to think, who needs God? Who needs God? Who needs something beyond us? Yeah. I saw this very powerfully when I was on denominational staff. I traveled the world a lot, and it was just incredible to go to places like China, Mexico, that Chiapas that I talked about in the sermon. I've been to Chiapas a couple of times, and to see the passion and the power of their faith in the context of their poverty. It's not a mutually exclusive thing. It often goes together. Other thoughts along that line?
You began your sermon by talking about whether the glass is half full or the glass is half empty and what kind of people we tend to be. Mm-hmm. And I decided I was a cat because the glass is on the floor. But part of that is I can't really answer that question when it comes to church, because I've experienced church both as the greatest source of my liberation and the greatest source of my oppression. And for me, the numbers rising in the global south is a mixed bag, because I don't know if the church there is oppressive or liberating. And it's hard for me to say because I have that global north bias. My concern is that the more oppressive church is growing faster than the more liberating church.
Mention the Methodist Church and what's happening to them.
Well, it's the Methodist Church in Africa, which is in the global south, that is really dividing the denomination in terms of LGBTQ rights. They're driving that, and a part of what has driven that has been the work of conservative evangelicals in Africa. So that's what I'm talking about.
Well, you guys are real good at getting way ahead of where I am. But this is great because this is relevant. And so let's talk about that a little bit. What are the ramifications? If we have said that 2/3 of all the Christians in the world are now in the global south, and that number seems to be rising every year.
Which is great. Oh, I'm sorry. I've seen it before, but I'll put it back in.
Thank you. Am I? No, I think I just somehow got it turned off.
Okay, that's good.
So, is that about the right volume? Yes. It's probably hurting Andrea's ears, but is everybody else okay?
Just one person.
So, 66% or more of the Christians are in the global south. What impact is that going to have on the church globally? Especially in churches and denominations that have a global presence. And you've just given one example of the United Methodist Church, which is pretty much everywhere in the world. But there are many other denominations. The Lutherans have a global presence. The Presbyterians have a global presence. Assemblies of God have a global presence. And so what is happening in these bodies? Bodies like, one of those bodies is the World Council of Churches. Okay? So everybody know what the World Council of Churches is? Global representative body that was formed after World War II, when all these things like the United Nations were coming together to try to work collaboratively. The World Council of Churches was all the major churches of the world coming together to say, let's work on issues together, let's support one another rather than compete with one another, and let's address the issues of the world collaboratively. And they did that, but guess what? All of those, where do you think the headquarters for the World Council of Churches is, folks? No. National Council of Churches, of course, is. World Council of Churches is in Geneva, Switzerland, okay? In the heart of Europe. Okay? And even in my ministry, in the years that I've been in ministry, all the high-level power brokers of the World Council of Churches, the movers and shakers of the World Council of Churches, what do they look like? You. Right. Exactly. White men. Okay. So, well, now all of a sudden, these bodies are representative. And it's painful and it's slow, but more and more, the global south is asserting their influence in those bodies. And they are now having more and more power. And especially in the bodies where it's representational based on size, they now have the numbers. They're in charge. And so they're having a huge impact on the agenda. And Beth has just highlighted one of them. So one of the issues is LGBTQ. And as you would suspect, those churches, by and large, are not open and affirming. They're quite conservative. And they are much more where the very conservative fundamentalist churches in the United States are on that issue. And so they are either pushing that body to the right or causing a breakage in the body, a severance in the body. So that's one issue, but there are other issues. The role of women. I mean, that may be less controversial than LGBTQ, but nonetheless, there are lots of those global South churches that are not okay with the role of women in leadership in the church. They read the scriptures not only very literally, but very selectively. And they point to those passages that seem to make their case. And again, we have that same dynamic in some churches in our country. So those are at least two issues on which many of us would not be so thrilled that the global South is exerting influence in the church. There are some other issues, however, in which we would probably be very supportive of them and participating with them. One would be the whole issue of black and white, yellow, green, diversity. Okay? These people tend not to be from the global South. They are not white. And they are mostly male, but they're not white. And so they come from Asia, they come from Africa. And so they are accelerating the move toward an inclusive, diverse Christian community. And the more of them are involved, the more that's going to be the case. Also, another huge issue that I think we care about very much in our congregation and in the UCC, poverty. Partnering with the poor. Liberation theology. Okay? That's very powerful in those places. And so they're going to be very on board and they're going to push that agenda. Any other examples anyone can think of? Those are four big ones, obvious ones, that are playing themselves out in the global church as well as nationally here. So that's going to have a major impact on global ecumenical relations, but it's also going to have a major impact on the church in the United States because we are having to respond to that. And we are advocating our position, and we feel very strongly about our positions. But in a global context, we are increasingly a diminishing presence. And Tony, I'm going to have to ask you to come to the mic for sure.
I think one reason for the growth of the church in the global South through the evangelicals and the conservative Christians is the entertainment value that it provides a very bored and poor people on the planet. We often forget that entertainment, drama, is something that fills gaps in people's lives as well. We don't use this anymore, by the way, global North and global South, just to tell you. We use the geography teachers of the planet Earth. We use...
What's the newest language?
It is core, is your industrial. We base it on quality of life. Germany and Denmark are core countries. Semi-peripheral, which is the United States, we fell because of gun violence. We lack a universal single-payer health system, healthcare system, and our increase in poverty. We also have 40 million homeless. And then there's peripheral, the extreme poor, which are places like Central, Western Africa, parts of India, parts
parts of People's Republic of China, things like that. So, but this, I mean, the picture's clear, but we use core, study peripheral, and peripheral.
Okay. So it's been further refined. When does that come into use? Is that relatively new or not?
It was, I think it's been since 2008, 2010 that we started teaching quality of life index to our youth.
Okay.
And what comes under quality of life? It's the number of live births. Ours, I think, ranks in the middle in the United States. So we've fallen.
Yeah, there's a lot of categories in which the United States is dropping.
Well, a wealthy nation becomes complacent. That's another part of the conversation. But there's the entertainment and drama value that the evangelical and the Pentecostal provide for what would otherwise be a very...
And for people who don't have so many other options.
Right, they don't have the education options and things like that. They're not simple-minded, but they lack the university systems, community college systems, things like that. I'm not saying that they're great here in the United States, but that those countries lack, I think, intellectual resources compared to the United States. So they're going to immediately fill that gap with something that's more alive and more in touch with what their immediate needs are.
And accessible. They don't have the money to buy concert tickets.
Right. It's free. And they also give out water, food. When you're giving out basic survival needs things, that's going to be who you rely on for everything else.
Thank you. Helpful comments. Thank you. Other comments? Okay. I think we'll wrap here. We're going to have lots of more opportunity. Next week, we're going to, as you would suspect, focus more on what's going on in this country and dig into that a little bit more. So, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. And see you next week. Thanks for all coming.
Hang on a minute. I have to get that photo. I'll be right back.